hopefully you've watched the other video or you had the experience of being in class with me and are a little bit more oriented as to what Latin is. And remember that I went through each of your rosters, and remember that roster in and of itself is an English word that is derived from a Latin word. You think that a roster is just a list of names, but as we know, it actually is from the Latin word rostrum, which was the speaker's platform in ancient Rome, in the middle of ancient Rome. And in 80 BC, the dictator Sulla, his full name was of course Lucius Cornelius Sulla, and this is something else that you're probably going to have to get used to. In class, I will have you repeat words, because the more that you pronounce them, because Latin is pronounced differently than English, and the more that you pronounce these names, the more that you'll remember them. So, even though it might be awkward, even though you are sitting perhaps by yourself, in your room, or wherever you might be, when I say repeat the word, do it. Don't just do it in your mind, actually say it. So, repeat after me. Lucius, Cornelius, Sulla. And you've got to say Sulla because he was a dastardly fellow. And in that year of 80 BC, he essentially made a list of names of people that were his political enemies, and he had them killed by putting that list of names on the most public speaker's platform in ancient Rome. And so, even though the original list of names on the rostrum was a list of names of people to be murdered, thankfully we are not on rosters to be murdered now. But many of you, I pointed out how your name is an example of not just necessarily a derivative, and remember, a derivative, go ahead and say it again, derivative, and hopefully in the pause you are saying these things, is a word that comes from a Latin word, or a word that comes from a Greek word, or a word that comes from any other word that is from another language, or you can even have derivatives within the same language itself. We have some English words that are derivative of other English words. And so roster, as a list of names coming originally from the speaker's platform, rostrum, is an example of a derivative. But some of your names, remember, that I pointed out, are a not only derivative, some of your names are what's called and go ahead and say it please, diminutive. And a diminutive is, remember, a word that is altered in some way to imply a smaller version therein. I won't go over it yet again because I already did in the previous video, but nevertheless, some of your names were as such. So, now we need to talk about what Latin is as a language and how the dastardly lie that Latin is a dead language is not applicable at all. Latin, along with English, both belong to a larger group of languages that are all related. It is a family of languages, and that family of languages is known as Indo-European. Now, in English, and I will explain why, it is incredibly valuable for you to study Latin. As I've said before, it is the best decision that you will make in high school because of all the ways in which you will understand the world around you in a better way. English has around 60%, over half of our words are directly derivative. Remember, that is a word that comes from another word, derivative from Latin. And an additional 20 to 30% of our words in English come from the language of Greek. And both Latin and Greek are belonging to the larger group of languages known as Indo-European. Now, English is what we call a Germanic language. It is not a language that directly evolved from Latin. Instead, it is a language that is derived from a version of German, as it were. Okay, so let's deal with Latin as a language, who spoke it, and why it is a bold-faced lie that it is a dead language. So, Latin was spoken by a group of people known as the Romans about 2,000 years ago. Rome, as you will know, is located in the middle of Italy on its western coast right here. Now, it's at this point I usually ask my students, who here is from Mansfield? And inevitably, or New Bern, or any of these other sorts of rural areas, and inevitably hands shoot up. And little do you know, as a resident of Mansfield or Newbern or wherever it is that you are one day going to take over the world. Now I know it is a shocking proposition to think that your little town will become the world empire, but that is exactly what happened in ancient Rome. So if you look over here at the map of Europe, the map of Africa, and Asia, there is a sea in the middle of it, and it's known as the Mediterranean. The word in and of itself, Mediterranean, I'll write it on the board, Medi means middle in Latin, from the word medium. And then you take the word terra, and that is the word for land. And so the Mediterranean Sea is called that because it is in the middle of the lands Europe, Africa, and Asia. Mediterranean. I hope I spelled that right, but who cares if I did not. Nevertheless, here you can see, all colored in green, is the extent of where the Romans had conquered. But they did not start out like that. If I were to get into my time machine that I keep in my closet and go back to the very beginning of Rome, and this is a date that you will have to remember, it is the date that I will say over and over and over again, and that is April 21st, 753 BC. On that date, 2,700 plus years ago, supposedly at the founding of Rome, if I were to get into my time machine that I have and go and visit the founding of Rome, it would look like Mansfield. And so how in the world did it come to grow to be the extent of the entirety of the whole of what's known as the Roman Empire? Well, it all started by the fact that it existed on the banks of the river known as the Tiber River, T-I-B-E-R. And as a little small village, exactly what's going to happen with Mansfield is that it will be attacked by a larger city. For example, Covington. Covington will look at Mansfield, think that that's a fine field, a field for a man, and thus they will, obviously, attack it. Mansfield, just like Rome did, will be able to defend itself admirably, win the war, and next thing you know, Mansfield is a little bit bigger. Well, who's going to now look at the larger, even more appealing Mansfield? Well, it most likely will be Conyers. And Conyers will attack Mansfield. Now, all of Covington, Newton County, and thus indeed Mansfield will win again. Then who's going to look at the new Mansfield? The bigger neighbor, Atlanta. And once again, it will grow, and it will grow, and it will grow, and it will grow. And as such, eventually, it will expand to Georgia with Mansfield. It will expand to the entirety of the Southeast, then east of the Mississippi, then the whole of the country, then all of North America. And you can see how Rome then expanded because it was under attack from its neighbors. Well, what eventually happened, however, is that Rome, just like Mansfield will, Mansfield, after taking over, let's say, the state of Georgia, will get the idea of, this is really working out, this whole taking over other places after we win wars. And then they will go on the offensive, but it didn't start out like that. However, my whole point is this. When Rome, speaking the language that we are in this class, Latin, and it's called that because the original area where Rome was located was known as Latium or Latium, will conquer all of these areas and essentially bring with them their culture. And the most important aspect of your culture is your language. And so when they expanded to the entirety of the boot and turned it green, then even though there were all kinds of other languages spoken in the boot, in Italy, essentially, when they bring in Latin, people begin to speak it. And when they go into Gaul, which is now what we call the country of France, it's the same thing. They originally spoke what are known as Celtic languages, or Gallic languages. But they began to speak Latin. And the same thing in Spain. Originally they spoke Celtic languages. This whole peninsula is known as the Iberian Peninsula, but its full name is the Celtiberian Peninsula. And so therefore, again, they spoke their original language. But when the Romans came in, they brought with them their language. And so, what happens is that languages will change over time. If you speak a language, it will change over time. And so, here you can see a branch of the Indo-European language family is that of Latin. But the people who were living in what we call France now, they were speaking Latin. And the people who were living in what we call Spanish now, they were speaking Latin. But when you speak a language, it changes. And there's going to be another video in which I show you explicitly how when you speak the language, it changes. And so, when they are so far apart, and you can look over again at the map, when they're speaking it here, and when they're speaking it here, and when they're speaking it here, over hundreds of years, they will change, but it will change differently from what is here, and here, and here. And so, it's at this point in which I make my point about how and why Latin is not a dead language. I say, who out here has a dog? And then you think if you have one, if you're brave enough, you put your hand in the air. And I say, what is your dog's name? And I don't know what the dog's names are. They're Fluffy. Or, oh wait, no. From 3 years ago, Trixie. I remember this dog. By Fair Oaks. He was sitting right over here, and he had Trixie. And so I said, Trixie is an adult dog. And yes, Trixie was an adult dog. And so I asked then, Trixie, at one point was a puppy, correct? Yes. And so, is Trixie the puppy dead? No. Trixie is not. And it's the same way with Latin. What we study in here is the Latin as it was originally spoken. We will not be speaking it per se, but the language we study is the language spoken originally by that civilization that took over so much of Europe, bringing with it its culture and its language. And as we study that original Latin, over thousands of years, that Latin changed in those different places. And here you can then see all of the different versions of Latin, and there are more than this, at the bottom you can see, that it changed into. And because Latin was spoken by the Romans, these languages that developed are known collectively as Romance languages. Now, sometimes people think that French is a Romance language because you say, oh, ma chérie, you're so beautiful. No, that's not it at all. It's merely because French is not really French. It is Latin, but spoken continuously in the area known as France, to the point of where it is so different now than what it was originally, we can no longer call it Latin, because it's really two different versions of Latin. The same thing for Italian, the same thing for Spanish. And so I tell my students, how many different languages do we offer here at Eastside High School? And they think 3. Latin, then we have 3 Spanish teachers that are across and down the hall, and then the French teacher. That is incorrect. We only offer 1, and that one language is Latin. Now, here we have, in this room, the original Latin. Across the hall is Spanish Latin, but we don't call it that, we just call it Spanish, because it is so changed. And then is French Latin. And so, Latin is not dead. It merely has been spoken continuously over the last 2,000 years, and if there's one thing you know, it is that when people speak a language, it changes. And it has changed so much that we now call it French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. These are the Romance languages. Now, is English a Romance language? No. English is a Germanic language. And as such, it is the sibling, the sister or brother, I suppose, of the languages of the Scandinavian countries, Norwegian, Sweden, Dutch, as spoken in the Netherlands, German, etc., etc. So the question then becomes, how did so much of Latin come into the English language to the point of where so many of our words can be seen as derivatives of the Latin language. And I will tell you all of that in another video.